Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Portland State University Studio MFA Remote Artist Talk series. This series is sponsored by generous contributions from the Wingate Foundation and the DePriest Professorship Fund by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation. We would like to start this event by acknowledging that Portland State University rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. Multnomah is a band of Chinooks that lived in this area. We thank the descendants of these tribes for being the original stewards and protectors of these lands since time immemorial. We also acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many Indigenous Native American families today. We are honored by the collective work of many Native nations, leaders, and families who are demonstrating resilience, resistance, and revitalization, healing, and creativity. We thank and honor the original caretakers of this land and support models and action of decolonization and reparations by our connected communities. This series brings together artists, curators, and critics from a variety of disciplines to explore the subjects of their work before a live audience. All of our lectures for fall term are being held remotely and live streamed through our PSU YouTube channel. Please follow our Instagram account at PSU Studio MFA to learn more about artist talks in the upcoming future. At the end of this morning's presentation, we'll be having a Q&A with Adam and the MFA cohort, and we'll also be fielding questions through the live stream chat. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Adam Kuby. Based in Portland, Oregon, Adam has been creating landscape-based, ecologically responsive public art commissions and installations internationally and in Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, Calgary, Boulder, Pittsburgh, Italy, and Norway. His art has been exhibited at the American Academy in Rome, the Duke University Museum of Art, the Ackland Museum of Art, the Whatcom Museum of Art, and the Public Art Fund. In 2014, Kuby was awarded the Rome Prize Fellowship in Landscape Architecture from the American Academy in Rome. He has attended artist residencies at Yado, the Gerasi Foundation, the UCross Foundation, and the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and the Arctic Circle Artist Residency. He has received national awards from the Public Art Network and from the American Society of Landscape Architects, Oregon chapter. Adam grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and currently lives in Portland, Oregon. Thank you very much for speaking with us today, Adam, and I'll let you take it over from here.
Thank you, Devin, for that introduction, and thanks to Ralph and the PSU program for inviting me. I've been following the PSU grad program for a while and have gone to multiple events there, and I've always been really impressed with the breadth of views and practices that you all are exposed to in your program, and I really appreciate being asked to share mine. I'd like to extend the land acknowledgement by acknowledging my own privilege in society and also in the art world as a white male. And while I've experienced otherness in various parts of my life, being gay, being Jewish, I've overwhelmingly benefited from the privileges I've had. And I never said this in a talk, but I think it's time to start saying it. So I came to my current art practice through a range of interests and experiences in the fields of landscape architecture, through ecology, environmental design. I worked in forestry, I've worked at zoos, and I feel like I've used my art practice to include and collaborate with all of these other disciplines, and also the forces at work on our planet: social, ecological, cultural, creative. And I also think that my roots in landscape architecture directed my practice towards public space. I've always been very committed and focused on public space. And I think, it kind of naturally follows that I would therefore be interested in, the interests and concerns of the public and the community in any given place. And so I've tried to make work that honors communities and their interests and their issues. I'm also a product of my 20th century art upbringing, and I'm still also really invested and a sucker for visually formal work. So that's some background on me. And I guess we could go to the presentation. So let me just get to that spot. Hold on for a second. Oh wait, I need to share my screen, don't I? Hold on. Share screen. Okay. All right. Great. Title of this presentation, Time and Materials, kind of a play on contractor time and materials when you're getting a project bid by a contractor, but really my work involves time a lot. And I kind of engage with time through my work in the material world. Right out of grad school, I started drawing up ideas, proposals, things that I was interested in. And one of them was Cliff Dwelling. It's a proposal for habitat for peregrine falcons in a skyscraper. Could be any skyscraper. And I think here I was really beginning to try to think about bridging the human, non-human interface that our species seems to have gotten to with the rest of nature. And I say nature in meaning just kind of all of sort of non-human ecologies and form making and forces and processes. And I think humans, we will label this as a skyscraper or a building, but I think animals and birds might not have that labeling and may just approach structures like this as a place to nest on or a place to hunt from. And so I sometimes try to, put myself in the way in which other species might encounter our built environment. And here's another one. Again, just a drawing idea. The idea is to create 500 tidal pools in an existing ocean jetty. I think other species often look for unused niches in the environment, and our built environment has so many unused niches, and in many ways our built environment is usually built for like single purpose things. So we build a jetty to do one thing, but in reality it could do multiple things. And so I try to bring that thought process to my work, whether it involves other animals or species or not. And again, I think nature abhors a vacuum, and there's so many vacuums in our built environment. For example, this is built for one purpose and one purpose only, but actually the reason I am including this slide is because the other thing that we humans do is when we build things, when we make things, we tend to want them, not always, but we tend to want them to be as long lasting and as straight and true and level for as long as possible. But the rest of the forces on the planet don't have that goal really. And so, you know, in non-human form making, things are always changing, growing, eroding, decaying, crystallizing. And so to me, the friction between our form making goals and processes and other ecologies that friction place is a very rich territory. And so, you know, tree roots buckling a sidewalk to me contains the seeds and the essence of a very epic drama. And so I started thinking about that as I started getting into doing public work. And this is a work, part of a triptych of pieces for North Vancouver BC's Parks Department. And here, basically the idea is that sort of the crack in the sidewalk kind of evolving and opening up to the old growth forest of the Northwest. And the idea here is that anything and everything could grow in the cracks and fissures and any part of this, this work, so that this piece will evolve and change as the forest begins to kind of continue the form making process that I started. And here from the side, you can see I planted that gap with increasingly evolving vegetation and hoping that it will continue on its own. And again, a Doug fir seedling could start growing in the very beginning crack and start to push and heave and further crack the stones. So it really is an evolving landscape that I think will hopefully take a life of its own. And I also, as it's obvious, I sculpted the stones to kind of simulate sort of fast forwarding of geologic erosion. So it's kind of doing its own little geologic time travel from one end to the other. I've done a bunch of these across the Northwest. Here for a stormwater retention basin / park in Seattle. And again, setting up a scenario with the stones and the trees, and then letting things evolve on their own. So it's been real interesting, and it's been I've loved this practice because there is some formal visual art making, but it's also, it's not done. It's on its way to something, and it kind of takes the pressure off of me just because I see the trees as my co-sculptors. And how pieces like this evolve is really for us to imagine 50, 100, 200 years in the future. And then I also like to think of future Seattleites 100, 200 years from now, kind of looking back and imagining what it started out as. It's not quite fair because they'll have photographs, but still there's this sort of conceptual conversation that I hope I've set up between now and the future, going both directions. In the meantime, I try to create places that are interesting gathering spots, places to sit. And also I feel like these pieces will kind of keep neighborhood residents engaged for long periods of time. A lot of times art goes out in public spaces and it doesn't change. And I think we kind of just not forget about it, but sometimes they can become kind of inert and background. So I hope that these things accompany people through their lives as they change and as the sculptures change. Here's another in that same location. Here are kind grid of weaving stones that you can see is just starting to be affected by the Doug fir that's rooting in and starting to lift some of those closer closer stones. And hopefully I'll be around to see this one change quite a bit. I gave this talk once, and somebody said, made a comment that I must either have a really big ego or a really small ego, since I'll never see my works come to full fruition. And I mean, I was a little taken aback, just kind of a personal observation in the middle of a talk. But what I realized is that this is what landscape architects do. It's also what farmers and stewards of land and ecosystems and land managers do, is you're working on something now that will not, you know, come to full fruition for decades and decades. And so it didn't even seem like a thing of ego or not ego. It just seemed like this kind of different relationship with time and with something sort of being finished. Maybe like that there isn't this idea that something is complete or finished. And I think of architects in general, most of the time, an architect's building will look its best, you know, the day the ribbon is cut, and not always, but I just think it's an interesting, different relationship to time when you're working with the living world. Another tree stone piece here in the Portland area, out in Beaverton, Tualatin Hills Parks and Recreation District. And here I worked with a local poet for a line of original poetry. And so it's a 100-foot line of granite and 27 native trees planted on either side of it. And as the trees grow, of course, things will shift and change. And we've all seen curbs buckled, and granite will break, and words will get mossy and cracked, and probably some of the words will disappear under soil or stone or roots. And I thought the poem was really a beautiful, beautiful compliment to the work. And I kind of see these as almost like as a poetry slam, where you've got this kind of mashup between the stone and the trees and the text, and as kind of a long, slow poetry slam. And I look forward to seeing how time adds to the sentiment. Another one also out in Tualatin Hills. This one, Strike Slip, is one that really starts to engage with geology and the geologic forces underlying the West Portland Hills specifically. So the top of the stones have a map of the geologic fault lines and parts of the Portland area, as well as, you know, previous earthquakes and seismic events. And then as the trees grow, here I'm working with existing ash trees, but as they grow, the idea is that they will start to shift those stones and mimic the geologic forces underground. And what I kind of like about this one here is we have sort of three levels of time going on. We have the human time, our human lifetime spans, and then we have the tree time, and then we have the geologic time, all kind of interweaving with each other here. Again, I think one of the things that I like to that I hope to do in my work is just to give people just a bigger perspective of what we are in. Because we can get so caught up in our daily lives and our daily time frames and our smaller world, and these trees growing around us and these geologic forces, underneath us. It's easy to just forget that they're happening alongside us, just at a different pace. When I was in Italy for that year, one of my favorite places to go was Monte Testaccio, which was like a 4-block across hill that was created by the ancient Romans when all of the amphorae, which are the clay vessels that brought in mostly wine and oil from all over the Roman Empire, and they couldn't be reused. So the Romans, in their systematic way, broke them and piled all of them in one spot. And here we have approximately 35 million broken amphorae, creating this kind of Anthropocene-sized hill in the middle of urban Rome. And so, of course, being in Rome, just being around sort of eons of disintegration and accretion and change in the urban fabric, but also the sort of the way that soil and vegetation and ancient material all kind of coalesce in Rome, I started thinking about just how other ways in which I could kind of engage with time and change over time and material, the way materials change over time. So I started breaking things myself, and was having a lot of fun working with different materials, but this was one of them that I was most fond of. So I bought 12 chairs at IKEA, and in my math geek part of my brain, I took each chair and broke it into increasingly more pieces. So 2, then 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, and the last line of the work is one chair broken into 2048 pieces. And it was really interesting to kind of be there and walk through the forum and see these parts of columns and lintels and things that had broken down to the point where you could still see what they were, and then at a certain point you were unable to see what they used to be, and then they just became material. And here again is kind of another kind of time travel. This is kind of in a very expository way, which I found very visually satisfying. And when I was at the Academy, I started looking at this building, which was built in 1910, and these were some travertine steps at the entrance, and I could see that they were already breaking down. And here was some moss growing in some holes on the steps, and I was just kind of realizing that, like, even the IKEA chair that you buy, the minute you take it home and put it together, it's already falling apart, just very, very slowly. But the building that you're in, the building that I'm in right now, they might be new, they might be well maintained, but they're all in some state of entropy and ultimate disintegration. So it was really fun to do this with different materials, cardboard boxes, plastic buckets. Everyone had its own kind of form and forms that kind of resulted from the cutting or breaking or sawing. And I don't know, it was made me think about scale and waste streams, and this one felt kind of like I was playing with a model city on a floor as a kid. Some kind of, modern Mideastern city. started to kind of play with the scale of large buildings versus small buildings versus shacks or huts. I don't know, it had a different connotation than some of the other ones. Of course, setting is always often part of my work. And this one using hay bales in a field where the hay was probably cut had its own resonance. At an artist residency in California at Jurassic, which is in the redwood forest, I worked with redwood benches. You can see the scale of the redwoods in the background. This is a permanent piece, so it will just sit there and decay and go back and be recycled back into the forest. And then I started having some opportunities to do some of these disintegration works at a different scale in public space. And one of them is in Tacoma, Washington, and it is a new park that's on the site of this copper smelter that has been there since the early 1900s. It was there, and it was quite an industrial site. It then became a Superfund site, and it created it smelted copper, so it created metal for so many things in our lives: toasters, cars, planes, ships. But it also created the largest dissemination of toxic arsenic, lead, and heavy metals in North America, coming out of that 300 and some foot tall smokestack. And so it was a, you know, double-edged sword. This was owned by the Guggenheim family. That's how they made a lot of their money, was in mining and smelting. And so this was one of their industrial sites. So they smelted the ore, they extracted the copper, and then they took the slag and they dumped it into Puget Sound. And you can see on the upper left a railroad car that accidentally fell into the water along with the slag. But you can see these kettle forms where the slag the molten slag was dumped into kettles, taken out and dumped into the sound. And they created an 11-acre peninsula of toxic slag. So sometime, I think in the 80s, it became a Superfund site. There were a lot of lawsuits. And for the last 25 to 30 years, it has been remediated, and it has gotten safe enough that 10 years ago, they deeded it to the city, and since then it has become a new public park for Tacoma, Washington. And so I got to be involved in the overall park design and some of the larger stone and landform elements. And I also got to work on an artwork for the park itself, which I started thinking about the smokestack and talking to residents about the sort of radical transformation of this site from, you know, industrial wasteland to public amenity. And a lot of the residents said that when the smokestack came down, that's when they felt like the transformation of this place began. So I started thinking about that and decided, well, that sort of act of the smokestack coming down as the kind of beginning of the transformation of the site, I decided to create a disintegration piece that that just speaks to that. directly. So again, like my other disintegration works, starting out with multiples of the same thing, and each line is one pipe, one 15-foot tall pipe. And the city the city that, well, it's in Tacoma, but it used to be Ruston, which was where the smelter was. And so kind of using rusted metal that's going to decay and age and rust, seemed like the right choice. And then again, it was really fun to work with a different shape starting out and see all the different ways in which cutting it in different directions created this sort of vocabulary of related similar forms that speak to each other. And yeah, and so the landscape architects created this wildflower meadow for the site right in the middle of where I wanted to create this work. And so this idea that the smokestack is grounding down into this wildflower meadow as this place transforms from one use to another. It's a harsh material to work with, and there were a lot of sort of sharp edges, but then there were also these circular forms that kind of softened it, and I think it worked well with the surrounding landscape. And I do think that it does bring the kind of the echo the site's past there in an abstract way. I think you have Gasworks Park in Seattle, in which the rusting existing gasworks were still able to be left. Here, nothing could be left because it was also toxic. So the soil had to be removed. All the machinery had to be, taken away. And so this felt like some way of evoking and referencing what used to be there. And it's also just interesting the way that this site, literally these 11 acres were created like one bucketful of soil at a time. And so this kind of accretion of lots of small things, because you could read this backwards as kind of lots of small events adding up to one larger event, or you could see these as going just the direction of entropy. But there are ways in which you could see this as formative and aggregating. And on the upper left-hand side of the slide, you see a rock slope, and there are 3 of these large rock slopes on the site. And I also worked with the design team to create, and I'm sorry I didn't add more slides of this. I wasn't sure I was going to have enough time, but I created 3 graduating or gradated, I don't know if that's a word, rock slopes that went from large rocks on the bottom to very small rocks at the top. On the very far end of the park, which you can just see past the building, there's another slope in which the rocks go the opposite direction. They start out small at the bottom and they go towards bigger. And then there's a third slope where the rocks start out small on the left and get bigger as they go to the right. So these were sort of trying to create a vocabulary that referenced and evoked the way in which the whole peninsula was created through this kind of Anthropocene scale event of industry, one bucket of slag at a time. Another project that I completed recently was up in British Columbia in Victoria, BC. And this site is associated with the British Columbia Parliament grounds. And I will just play this video to show you this plaza that I was asked to create a work for, which is directly behind the BC Parliament buildings. And when I was asked to work on this space, they asked me to address the overall ecology and environment of Greater Victoria, BC. And they also asked me to try to also reference or include the First Nation history of the region. And so that didn't come from me, that came from the client, so to speak, the city. And so I started thinking about the site, and I also started thinking about this building just adjacent to the site. And this is the front of the BC Parliament building. The plaza that was going to be working on was on the back. But as you can see, here we have the British imperial story of Victoria, British Columbia writ large in this edifice. And so I started to wonder how I might be able to address the site's history before the British period, but also address the period that we're now in and moving into the future, which I'm hoping is going to be a more integrative period for British Columbia and for everywhere. So how to do that? How to reference another culture that's not mine, include the past as well as hopefully the future. And so I started, the piece is called We Acknowledge, and my first move was really to propose, which they accepted, to engrave an acknowledgement statement down the middle of this new plaza. And again, the plaza is surrounded by government office buildings, Ministry of Education, Environment, Forestry. And so it seemed like an important thing to do and a worthwhile statement to put into stone. I also worked closely with the First Nation Lekwungen community to craft both the acknowledgement statement, but also to craft this corresponding welcome statement in Lekwungen language. And we worked together on all other aspects of the work. I presented the idea and the concepts to the First Nation Council to get their input, their feedback, and their approval. And so how to sort of bring those ideas into physical form. What I came up with was the idea of creating 3 compositions in stone that, for me, speak to the relationship between contemporary Canada, its ecology and geology, and its pre-European, pre-contact history. And so this idea of these large, planed, honed, cut, contemporarily shaped stone slabs paired with an exact equal weight of rough-hewn boulders was the way I came, my entry into the idea, and as a companion to the acknowledgement and the welcome statements. And so I really did weigh out all of these boulders. We had a big scale on one of the cranes and we weighed each one, and I selected a group of boulders that as a group weighed the exact same as the slab. And so really trying to communicate a sense of parity and literally an equality between these two elements. And then on top of the slabs, there was an opportunity to use that surface. And so I decided to engrave maps of the Victoria area. And in this central slab, it just shows a map of the original traditional Lekwungen territory and the different family units, traditional family units geographically in that area. And then on the other two slabs, I decided to put two maps that showed areas, specific areas of Victoria pre-contact, before European contact, and then what they look like now. And so here you can see on the left, the pre-contact part of Victoria, and then on the right, current urban Victoria. And I worked closely with the local historical museum, and again, the local First Nation community to get all this information. And the third composition, obviously the three compositions side by side, slab on top, and then this third composition, boulders on top and spilling over. And in this was again trying to communicate that sense of sort of the cultural historical time of the last 500-600 years, and then the geologic time, which may over time, over eons and eons, this human time frame may just be a blip. And and I'm proud of this work. I think it was tricky as a white person to create a work at this moment in time that includes another culture. And I think that I did it in a respectful way. I hope that it comes across like that. I kept my own aesthetic, my own conceptual practice throughout, which I think helps with that clarity. And I do think that the First Nation community was very glad to have this piece happen and to have more First Nation visibility and presence in this prominent place. And I think the acknowledgement statement was a good move. I mean, we could all say that it's, you know, all it is a statement, but I think words matter, and words engraved in stone carry a weight that that hopefully kind of makes them feel more more real. But again, they are just words, so there is that that issue of with that we need words plus actions. There's another shot of it. Oh, and the other thing that I wanted to point out was that the boulders themselves, I was trying to find the exact same kind of granite, and it was quite hard to find that because the quarry are just different quarries, and different sources. But what we ended up was we found granite boulders that matched the slabs that were actually from the foundation of Victoria's old post office and customs house, which is undergoing, being gutted for a new use. And so they pulled out a lot of the foundation, and we just happened to be able to use them in the artwork. So parts of sort of Victoria have found their way into the artwork, and I feel like it adds another layer of time in the relationship of all these elements in the work. So to switch gears, a lot of these public projects take years and years to come to happen. And, I was just feeling more and more like I just needed more ephemeral pieces and work to balance out these long-term projects that are that are heavy, as well as take years to finish. So one of the residencies I went on was up to the Arctic Circle, which was a fantastic opportunity. And so I started to redirect a bunch of my practice to work more ephemerally, more quickly, but also I wanted to start to try to shift some of my practice to address climate change, and specifically sea level rise as well. So up in the Arctic, I decided to just work with fabric. It was easy. It was left no trace. And here, just working with gold fabric to try and just see if I could somehow impart a sense of value, kind of a Tiffany box lined sort of jewelry box to put the snow in, just to create a sense of value to this ice and snow that's so far away, and so much of the time out of sight, out of mind. And of course, the glaciers are melting and breaking naturally, but also increasingly because of climate change. And one of the other artists on the residency, Shohei Katayama, and I were working together, and we came up with this idea of working with one of the cracks in one of the glaciers. In Japan, this practice of kinso kuroi, it's this idea when pottery breaks to repair it using gold inlay. And we just both looked at these cracks and were like, we should do a golden repair. And in the Japanese tradition, that golden repair is kind of bringing attention to the breaking, and sort of embracing the imperfection and the disintegration and the cracking, as opposed to venerating the perfect, the perfect piece, the perfect, finished element of a beautiful piece of pottery. But we just thought that sort of bringing attention to the imperfections and the ephemerality of the glaciers, like the pottery, was an elegant, poetic move. And then, as Ralph was saying before we started, I was also at the Rauschenberg Artist Residency in Captiva, Florida. And there I was really trying to focus on sea level rise, because Captiva Island in Florida is a barrier island. It's very susceptible to sea level rise. And again, just wanting to try to focus my work, some of my work, on how are there ways in which we can make this more visible, more, front and center in people's minds? Are there ways, so for this piece, Sea Level Clock #1, I was experimenting with the form of this circular clock that could track both long-term sea level rise, but also in this temporary piece that I just put up for several days to show that it also can track tidal fluctuations and daily fluctuations, and kind of used a quick ephemeral temporary material. There is a bit of a nod to Christo here with the fabric in the water in Florida, bright colors. But ultimately, I'm really interested in how I might create some of these sea level clock forms to really show the change, the long-term change in sea level rise. And so hopefully in the future, I might be able to construct some of these in a more permanent material. And I've been playing around with this idea of using oystercrete, which is kind of a method that people are using to create oyster habitat and oyster reefs. People in the Bay Area are using oyster balls, which are like these reef balls made out of concrete and oyster shells, and oysters and other crustaceans like to grow on other shells. And so they're playing around with the idea that a larger sea level clock could also, could also act as a tidal pull on top of the form as well, to activate as many of its surface areas as possible. So hope that will happen in the future. And then of course, these things would be there long term for decades and hopefully clock some amount of sea level rise, hopefully not too much. Also, while I was at the Rauschenberg, I started playing around with just stretching blue fabric horizontal to the surface of the land in places where the idea was to try to mark where sea level might be at some point in the future. So there was a lot of information that the Rauschenberg Foundation had collected about where sea level was tracked on the property. And so I started stretching fabric here and there to show where the water might actually be. And I was drawn to these just because they created this kind of visceral, ghostly, ominous presence within this general bucolic tropical scene. And then a year later, I've been working with this sort of global art collective called Microgalleries, and they were doing a project. It was a global day of creative action to coincide with the UN Climate Summit last year and the Youth Climate Strike. And so Microgalleries outreach to all of their contacts all over the world, and we got people on 4 continents to stretch fabric in places where sea level may rise and use it as a way to talk to people, engage with people, get the message out. And people really took it and made it their own. They They stretched it. This group in Papua New Guinea made a kind of whole ritual about it that related to sea turtles. Some people just stretched it and set it out there, and other places, it became more of an activist performance prop. I went with Microgallery's crew to Miami, and we took it to Miami Beach. And literally, we just walked into the crowd and unfurled this blue fabric, and people just grabbed it. And then people started talking, and it was a great photo op. And then I was on this beach in Miami, on Miami Beach, and just went up to this group of fellows who were on a tech retreat of some kind or a conference, and sort of engaged with them. A few days later, we went to New York, and we brought the fabric to some marches down Fifth Avenue, and literally just, again, unfurled it, made a few comments, and people just grabbed it and went with it and started chanting slogans that they came up with. So it had quite a life for that day. A group in Venice it was great to see it in this location, and they spent a couple hours marching it around. And also a group in Gaza, Palestine, worked with it. And they made this short video. Along with some music. And people did performances with it, and set it out in different locations and beautiful. And it really had a life of its own. That was. How am I doing on time? I just want to make sure I'm not running over.
We're a little bit over time, but you can spend a couple more minutes and finish up if you'd like.
Okay. I mean, I can stop here if you'd rather me.
No, I mean, it's like it would be good to see the rest of the slides you prepared, I think.
Okay. All right. I'll go very quickly. And then I was just gonna. So anyway, that was a very, I thought, a lovely, and it was just great to open source a project. I'd never done that before, and to just open source this so that people could participate and take it and make it their own, connect with their own community. I just think it's a really interesting model for doing social practice work, and I'd like to try it again. And I'm excited to take Blue Fabric to the next climate march once we're all finished with the pandemic. So I think it'll have a life that will continue. And then the last thing I was going to show was just a project I just finished in Boulder, Colorado. Again, back to permanent long-term work. Boulder is, outside of Boulder are these incredible landforms called the Flatirons. And I was drawn to them, as is everyone in Boulder. They're kind of the iconic symbol of the city. And so I was trying to figure out whether I could transpose the exact angle and orientation of the Flatirons into downtown Boulder And so this is the result of that. I created 3 large-scale steel sculptures, piece called 55 Degrees, and they literally bring the angle and orientation and the geometry of the Flatirons into Boulder in a very abstract, minimal, geometric way. And I worked pretty hard to like literally transpose the exact angle. And there's 3 related portal forms, and there's lots of unexpected ways in which they are starting to have conversations with each other and with the mountains. Someone commented that it was like the mountains were kind of given windows to look inside themselves, which I kind of love that comment. And in many ways, I think this work is, you know, more rooted in 20th century art making tradition than a lot of my recent work. And, you know, this idea of placing large objects in public spaces. And I'm actually okay with that. I think people are really responding to them positively, in part because I really did geek out on the mountains that they love and that defines this community. And so they've really had a good reception. And I think that they do create, I'm hoping, this relationship with the larger landscape of the area. And I feel like there's some temporal element of these that I'm not quite aware of yet, that connects to my other time-based works. I don't know, maybe they're just giant time machine portals that we haven't figured out how to control yet. But as I was preparing this talk, I was realizing that these works do somehow relate back to this first piece I showed, but it's kind of the inverse. And again, I think I'm just looking to kind of create that better connection between making processes and the ecological and geological and other non-human form processes and forces that are going on around us. So that was kind of interesting to see that return to that thought. All right, I am done. Sorry that took longer than I thought.
That's no problem. Thank you, Adam. Now we can open it up to some questions. I did see that there is a question in the YouTube chat. So Donald Foley asks, so much of your work alludes to the land art movement. I think about Richard Long, but in the case of your work, so much of the materials you play with is loaded with historical meaning. Can you talk about how you choose materials for your work?
That's a great question. I think that when I choose materials, it's really it's a response to what are the forces at work on this site in this region, and sometimes, obviously, you know, the last piece I showed, I chose steel versus stone, partly because I wanted to be able to sort of celebrate that angle of 55 degrees in a kind of a way that was very formal and not land-based. Again, because I think I was trying to create something that was very urban and very architectural, that then spoke to the mountains. In other aspects, I choose stone because it's something that will interact and engage with trees and soil and time in a very kind of tested way. I mean, some of these pieces could be around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and steel won't. And, you know, you can go through a graveyard and you can see the way that text and stone and time and moss and roots all play with each other very well. So I think a lot of that is the choice of materials is based on, is often based on kind of what forces am I interested in relating to or connecting with. And I think in terms of the land art movement, obviously I'm very, you know, connected to a lot of the environmental artists, from Christo to Smithson to the other ones that were mentioned. And sometimes I feel like I'm doing applied environmental art or applied conceptual art, because I'm trying to take it into not so much the kind of rarefied, pristine world of the desert, you know, a piece out in the middle of nowhere, but I'm trying to make these works that, you know, are able to engage with people and public and spaces and activities and all the things that happen in urban areas. And so, yeah, it's kind of taking a lot of those impulses of environmental art and trying to kind of apply them into living, working public spaces.
Awesome, thank you. Raja's camera is not functioning at the moment, but she has a question. So maybe Raja can ask the question and then Darby can go next.
Sure. Hi, I'm sorry, my camera just stopped working. But thank you for the presentation. And I really enjoy that first set of projects that you shared with us. To me, it stands out because there's this collaboration with nature, and when you put the stones, that allows for the tree roots and the plant roots to shift them. That stands out to me because there's this room for change and for things to sort of happen and surprise, I guess, to happen, which also shift your work that you sort of originally installed in that area there. And my question is, when you mentioned that your ideas, that your projects take time, and I can take up to several years to come to fruition, I was wondering about how those ideas shift. And maybe you would start with an idea for a proposal. And so I was wondering, does that idea shift by the time you start working on the project, or how does that, or does it evolve, or how do you approach the ideas from the beginning of the proposal to when you're working?
That's interesting, and it's yeah. There's there's always the time that a project takes as one is beginning conceptually, and then, you know, for these public projects, it's, you know, it's usually 2 to 3 years of presenting and getting approval and working with suppliers and working with engineers, and so that process sometimes can be kind of a little bit inert on the kind of the generating the ideas and the thoughts, because with a lot of these projects you have to have everything kind of lined up so that you can start going through the steps of making it happen. And so once that starts, there's not often, sometimes there's the ability to shift and change the idea. But a lot of times you kind of have to have that concept, you kind of have to stick with it on the sort of the larger envelope of the idea, so that you can kind of march it through all the approval steps. So I think a lot of my sort of thinking through how these things are going to happen, you know, is in the beginning. I mean, one thing I would say is that a lot of times you run into issues where, oh, they won't let you do this in this park, or you can't do it around that tree, or you have to move it to this area that doesn't flood. And then you have this opportunity to start thinking about, oh, well, if I'm going to do it in this location, then I might use a different palette of stone or materials or trees or vegetation. And then, so there is often, as the process unfolds, ways in which you can let your process unfold with it. And some of the pieces with the text and the poetry and the geology and the maps, those are things that I don't have to have those nailed down at the beginning, and I can really allow myself to just dream into how best for that idea to take form. I mean, for instance, for the geology pieces, I was playing around with all these other ways in which trees could move stones and you could measure that. So I was playing around with a lot of different formats for that tree stone interaction to take place.
Thank you.
I'm so intrigued by your influence of landscape architecture, and like Raja similarly mentioned your collaboration with nature, with the land, in terms of creating these site-specific installations. And one thing that's really striking to me is the inclusion of even when using natural materials like stone or the redwoods for the deconstructed piece, the way that they are, the hand of man is obvious in the sharp cutting, or the words imprinted, or in the the shape and the construction of the chairs and deconstruction of the chairs, in contrast with the actual redwood trees or the rougher stones. And I was wondering, from a conceptual perspective, what that significance is for you, if it's perhaps suggesting the possibility for collaboration between like man and the environment, like, as this climate crisis and the Anthropocene progresses, or just a little bit more about that conceptual decision.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there's several reasons for those choices of kind of having those two come up against each other. I think, partly, again, sort of going back to those initial slides I showed of the buckling sidewalk, and that friction between these two form-making, tendencies and processes is something I wanted to show that, like, where those two meet. And so the idea of putting stones out that are really sharply, cleanly cut, that are obviously man-made, that show that kind of human precision and ingenuity and all that, and then have that come up against these other, forces, felt very, conceptually, that's kind of what it is. It also, that's visual juxtaposition. It's pretty satisfying. And I think it's been, you can see it in the art of the 20th century for so much of it, this kind of way of which especially, you know, with land art, with Richard Serra, with James Turrell. I mean, there's this kind of like bringing our, like in some ways that frame of the last piece I showed, those big giant windows is just, I mean, it's almost like eye candy. It's like we're so drawn to looking through frames. We're so drawn to I mean, I think that there's a strong satisfaction in seeing kind of the clean, the clean lined feeling of a human interaction, and then that juxtaposition with the other, with the non-human forces, feels like it sets both of them off. So you can see, it's almost like you can see the beauty in both when they're juxtaposed up against each other.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I mean, there's many answers to that question, but those were just the first few.
Oh, Alex, were you going to ask a question?
I had a quick question if there wasn't anyone else in line. I was kind of curious on your, well, I guess actually first I want to say how much I really enjoyed that piece you just put up in Boulder. I think it's beautiful, and I think highlighting those mountains is really fascinating. I'm there for a little bit, and it's so funny how that's how you can direct yourself around the whole town. It's just like, okay, I know I walked away from that mountain. I know I have to go towards that. Like, and so it's really interesting to highlight them. But I was curious kind of what your thoughts or how you process kind of the viewership of your work, since all of this work is so public oriented or public to the people who are present in that area, since it can't really be moved. I at least going through, I don't think I saw, if you've had work, I haven't seen it, that was in a white walled gallery. So you're kind of, seems like almost 100% outside of that kind of formalized art space, and sort of how that alters the perception of your ideas, or like kind of how you function in that.
Yeah, it's kind of a different subset of the art world to be working mostly in public space. And I find it thrilling, and I find it you can't control it as much, obviously. You can't control how people are going to respond to it. You can't control what happens to it. But you can, again, I guess I go back to kind of like a kind of multifaceted approach of, it's maybe harder to necessarily control things and do one thing, but my hope is that the pieces, I guess, are multifaceted in a lot of ways. That they're multifaceted in that they're conceptually accessible to a wide range of people, which is just part of the job when you're doing public art. And it, you know, you go through the public process, you have input, you try to make work that, and for me, I try to make work that people who don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about the work can still have an experience, and then people who are willing to put more time and energy into it can have multiple, you know, other layers and depths of experience with the pieces. So there's partly that. There's partly the idea of trying to make them multifaceted in viewed from any angle that somebody might be coming through, multifaceted in, they might be places to sit or stand or hang out or climb on or spend some time in. They might be places that, or ways in which they they have multiple functions throughout their lives. So I think that's one of the ways in which I kind of appreciate and shift my approach towards making work in the public realm. And I've also done playgrounds and skate parks and other things that really do then kind of sort of play to a very specific audience. And in that way, those pieces become functional art as well as visual, and they have even more shift into, is this landscape architecture, is this playground, is this you know, not just specifically visual art.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. Thank you.
I have a multi-part question. So, I mean, so much of your work is about building entropy in essence in this, like, there's so much about it that is about reminders of impermanence, thinking about trees and geology kind of like shifting the overall schematics of the work. But then there's also kind of like this testament to the human impulse to destroy things. You talked about like deconstructing objects as being somewhat satisfying. And then there's also like the highlighting of minute components of things that we consider as like isolated or concrete, right? But then it kind of like gets me thinking about how building knowledge often in our social systems requires the deconstruction of things. And I was just kind of wondering, I'm assuming that given that you work in this realm, that you must probably think about that a lot. This concept of to build something up also requires that things must be destroyed. And I was wondering if you might be able to speak more to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do this so focused on the building up and the creation and the kind of, you know, that culture and society is kind of, you know, one layer, you know, is formed on the next layer, and that's knowledge and information and structures and cities. And there's very little, there's much less thought and consideration of the way in which things also are devolving and coming apart and making room for the next set of things to be, you know, created in the sort of in the space that's not there. And I guess, you know, the natural world is someplace where that's all happening simultaneously. You know, one thing is eroding so that another thing can start growing. One thing is, you know, one mountain is decaying, so, you know, an agricultural valley can fill with rich soil. And so there's this, and I do think it's a really interesting point. I haven't really thought that much about it, that in our human culture, it's really not valued as much, or it's not thought of, and it's more the building up. Does that touch it?
Yeah.
For you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess then to follow up with that, it's like, I mean, so much of your work is in the public realm. And so it's like, and in order to sort of like even begin the process, I'm assuming that you go through a proposal process, right? And if entropy is like a component of the work, I'm kind of wondering how is entropy integrated into the proposal process, And I'm kind of wondering what that looks like. And then I have like another question about a sketch, like a sketch that you showed. Sorry, so many questions. I'll let other students ask. I'll let students ask questions.
No, this is fine. So your first question was, does the entropy and the disintegration, factor in the proposal? Absolutely. Absolutely. And it was funny. I think, I lived on the East Coast for a lot of my sort of adult, younger life. And I was trying to get these ideas going. And I was putting out stuff that had these ecological processes happening. And for some reason, I wasn't getting much traction. And then I moved to Portland in 2004 and started applying for things, and immediately started like, well, I could create these works that are going to have trees, and they're going to grow, and then they're going to decay, and they're going to be here for a long time. And people immediately went like, go for it. And I think that was really helpful to be here in a part of North America where nature is just really right there. It's happening, right outside the city. It's happening in our backyards. We have giant trees. I wish I could be in Portland in 200 years and see all these trees that are already in my neighborhood, are like that person's not going to be able to park in their driveway in 10 years from now. And it's like, what are these big trees going to start doing in this city? What are the decisions people are going to have to make? Are they going to have to choose between their driveway and this tree? Or are they going to keep the trees? And I just feel like this was a really good fit in terms of location for me to start playing with this vocabulary.
That was actually something I was wondering, is that shift to moving here, how much that would have had an effect, because I study a lot of geology myself, and the geological time of Portland, like if you go up the gorge or anywhere, it's so like in your face. That's very over the top. And so yeah, I think that's really interesting. It took hold a lot quicker here.
And the trees do grow big and fast here. And so that was also another impetus for, engaging with them here. Did you have a question about a sketch?
Yeah, I did, but I want to reserve this time so that students can ask questions.
Okay.
I'm sure they have a few. Sophia?
I guess I'll redirect. I have a question about the chairs. You were breaking them apart, and it was a process of disintegration. And you knew the exact numbers between each. Why? What does that mean to you, or what does that mean?
Oh, I think it was the process of trying to take something, break it in half, and then break those halves in half, and then break those halves in half, as a way of kind of keeping the size of the pieces fairly constant, so that at the end you end up with pieces that are all about the same size. So that was kind of the math geek way that I kept the size of the pieces similar, and even with the piece I did for the smelter site in Tacoma, each of those pieces was, I would cut the pipe in half, and then I would cut that half in half, and then I would cut those halves in various ways. And it's just the constraint that I used in my own, like in the making of it. And again,
so the numerical part doesn't have, you don't have attachment to that, because you knew
I don't have attachment to the numerical part, but it was just the act of like breaking something in half and then breaking those halves in half was the mathematical, like that is the math. And as I said, I'm a sucker for visually formal work, and there was something very satisfying about kind of methodically breaking this stuff up as opposed to just kind of randomly breaking it. And I think partly that also tied into this idea of like, when does something go from being like a recognizable known thing to being just stuff? And I think partly I was like looking at it going, oh, okay, I can see that that's part of the chair leg and that's part of the seat. And then I can, at some point I was just like, oh, I can't see that anymore. I can just see stuff.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat. We're over time now, but it seems important to ask this question. So City Chen asks, with so many of your work are situated in the land, what role do you see the work play in mediating the land-based relationship, either between different people or between the people and the land?
Can you say that again?
With so many of your work situated in the land, what role do you see the work play in mediating the land-based relationship, either between different people or between the people and the land? I feel like that's such a multi-part question.
Yeah, it has some different elements to it. I mean, just as a general, I hope that the works become kind of inseparable from their site, and so that the land and the work, especially with the tree pieces, that those merge and don't become separatable. And I mean, in that way, I feel like a lot of these pieces are just, in some ways, they're like touchstones to allow you to experience what's happening on that land. And you can't do it without being some form of imposition. Of a greater connection to the actual workings and processes going on with the land.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Julia, yeah?
It's a really quick one, but given that a lot of your practice is based on activism, I was wondering if you engage in other forms of activism besides your art practice.
You said activism, right? Yeah, I've always been someone who's been politically active and environmentally active. I guess I don't see a lot of my pieces as being like where activism is their kind of front, primary activity. That's interesting to me. Besides my fabric climate change work, do you see my other work as kind of as a form of activism?
Yes, especially when you started talking about it right in the beginning. When you talked about how we are trying to build a world that will last forever, but it doesn't. And also when you talk about the bench that you put in the forest, you thought about a material that would be reintegrated by the forest. So I see that as a sort of activism.
Well, that's great. I mean, I'm glad to hear that that feels like a kind of form of activism. And I guess for me, sort of ecological issues have just been like such an important part of my life. And it is one of the things that I really wanted to do with my work. And I remember when I was younger and I was studying and I was so sort of compelled and just in awe of a lot of the early environmental artists, and just someone like Christo and Smithson, just the fact that they took their art out of the gallery, off the pedestal. I mean, it was one of the first eras where people are like, no, I'm going to put this in the middle of a field in California. I'm going to, and just that act was kind of like, hey, look at the land, look at the environment. Even this, I don't know if we have time, but this steel monolith in the Utah desert is just so fascinating to me, because on the one hand, it's an imposition, but on the other hand, it's like bringing all of this attention to the beautiful desert of Utah. And then the people who removed, the guys who removed the monolith were like, well, we want to remove this because this land is not, it can't take the amount of people that are going to come and try and find this. And so just this kind of act of putting this piece of steel in the middle of the desert has created, I mean, it's not all like necessarily positive, but it has created a lot of interest in the environment and the land and the places that it's placed in. And I do remember, again, kind of like, you know, with Christo's work and others of that era, like, I want to do that kind of work, but I want to make it work for the environment just one more step than it is. Like they took the first step, and then there are many, many other artists. I'm just one of hundreds of thousands of artists that are like, okay, now I want to make work that actually like helps to solve environment, to bring attention to it. And it's really nice to know that just these pieces of trees and stones growing and interacting together has that feels to you like that is a statement trying to push us towards a better relationship with other ecologies. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
We've run out of time, but Adam, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It was great to hear you talk about your work, and thank you so much for speaking with us and answering our questions. And we hope to see you soon, maybe like more in like in real space as opposed to virtual space. But thanks for taking time to join us today.
Thank you so much, and it was great to meet you all, and I look forward to more interactions, and maybe the next time there's a climate march, you could join me and we'll grab some blue fabric.
Sounds great. Have a good rest of your week.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.